and it is day 177 of the second Trump administration. And tonight, new inflation numbers are confirming what many economists have predicted, that Trump's tariffs would drive prices higher and higher.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said on Wednesday that she and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had agreed to strengthen trade collaboration.
Imagine waking up to headlines revealing that Canada, America's closest neighbor, has abruptly rejected more than 150,000 tons of American beef within hours. Mexico moves in seizing a $1.2 billion market that had long been dominated by the United States. Two nations once seen as dependable partners are now reshaping a new trade landscape, one where America is no longer at the center. The fallout was immediate. Contracts were scrapped, prices spiked, and confidence in the quality of American agricultural products began to erode. What exactly is unfolding, and why does it directly affect food prices, jobs, and the economic future of millions of Americans? This video breaks it all down. Canada rejects 150,000 tons of U.S. beef. Mexico captures the $1.2 billion market overnight. Watch until the end before the United States loses yet another strategic foothold. The chain reaction began when relations between the Trump administration and Canada entered a tense new phase, with tariffs putting years of cooperation under strain. In July 2025, as the U.S. continued to battle high food prices and lingering supply chain disruptions, Washington made a move that further unsettled the market. The administration announced a 35% tariff on imports from Canada, including beef, grains, dairy, and other essential agricultural products. Supporters claimed it was a long overdue stand to protect American farmers and reclaim leverage in trade negotiations. But across many U.S. farming states, the reaction was far from enthusiastic. With tariffs already elevated and costs climbing higher, farmers questioned whether Canada would remain a reliable long-term partner. The answer came swiftly. Less than a week later, the Canadian Parliament passed Bill C-202, granting the government authority to halt agricultural imports from countries deemed a threat to domestic food security. While the bill never named the United States, its target was unmistakable. The policy took effect immediately. More than 150,000 tons of American beef were denied entry. Shipments prepared for Canadian buyers sat idle in cold storage across Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas. Key agricultural hubs, several processing plants, were forced to temporarily shut down operations. At the same time, American consumers faced a puzzling reality. Beef prices continued to rise despite sufficient domestic supply. Public doubts began to surface. If Canada rejected American beef, what exactly are Americans being sold? Canada's move was not driven by emotion. It was a calculated signal that dependency on a partner willing to weaponize trade would no longer be tolerated. Canadian farming associations echoed the sentiment, arguing that food security cannot hinge on short-term politics or unilateral pressure. With Bill C-202, Canada erected a protective barrier not just for its agricultural sector, but for its long-term economic direction. From the U.S. perspective, the decision sparked deep reflection. Many American farmers, especially in states like Kentucky, found themselves trapped between political decisions and unforgiving market realities. They had hoped Washington would defend agriculture with the same resolve Canada displayed. Instead, it was the longtime neighbor that acted first, closing its doors and charting an alternative course. A relationship once viewed as stable and uniquely close is now governed by stricter rules and diminishing trust. And Canada is not acting in isolation. The rejection of U.S. beef is only the opening move. Ottawa is actively securing new partners, ones viewed as more predictable and less confrontational. Unexpectedly, that partner is Mexico, America's other neighbor, once considered peripheral, now stepping into a central role. Just years ago, the idea that Mexico would replace the U.S. as Canada's primary beef supplier would have sounded absurd. Today, that scenario is unfolding in real time, so rapidly that many U.S. farms and livestock businesses were caught unprepared. Contracts shifted, buyers moved on, and long-held assumptions about proximity, alliances, and guaranteed markets are being dismantled. Now appear insufficient to sustain that relationship when Canada unexpectedly turned away more than 150,000 tons of American beef, citing tariff concerns and ongoing disruptions from Washington. Many assumed the market would merely pause, but that assumption proved wrong. Mexico moved swiftly and quietly, filling the void almost immediately. There is irony in the fact that two nations which once viewed the United States as the undisputed regional trade anchor are now working together to redesign the very supply chain America once led. During the first half of 2025, as trade tensions between Washington and Ottawa intensified, Mexico was already preparing behind the scenes. Media reports described phone calls between the Canadian Prime Minister and the Mexican President as routine diplomatic exchanges, but insiders understood they signaled a significant realignment soon after both governments began holding rapid-fire discussions focused on agriculture, beef imports, and quarantine standards at a pace that surprised even seasoned observers. Once Canada made the decision to seek alternatives, the question became unavoidable: why return to a partner that repeatedly exposed them to tariff threats and political uncertainty? For many American farmers, the deepest frustration is not merely displacement but replacement by a country once dismissed as less competitive. Mexico, however, has changed following a parasite incident earlier this year. Its authorities worked closely with the USDA and CFIA, regaining full food safety certification within weeks. The first beef shipments re-entering the North American market were not only cleared but accompanied by comprehensive documentation detailing quality controls, slaughter timelines, transport conditions, and packaging standards. That level of transparency quickly reassured Canada's largest supermarket chains. In a matter of months, Mexico achieved what had taken the United States years to establish. As a result, Canada began importing tens of thousands of tons of Mexican beef each month, with targets set at 150,000 tons by year's end, precisely matching the volume once sourced from the U.S. More critically, these contracts are long-term, stable and profitable agreements that once supported families and farms across Texas and the Midwest. Now the trucks that used to carry beef into Ontario and Alberta sit idle in farmyards. This story extends far beyond trade statistics. It is about American livelihoods being quietly squeezed by a transformation few were prepared to confront. The ripple effects are spreading rapidly, touching farmers, consumers, and the entire agricultural ecosystem. When headlines announced that Canada had rejected over 150,000 tons of U.S. beef, urban readers may have skimmed past, but in rural towns where livestock trucks once lined up each morning outside slaughterhouses, the message was unmistakable: a vital artery of rural America had been cut. From Kansas to Nebraska, farms that once exported reliably to Canada are now burdened with unsold inventory. Storage costs rise daily while feed and veterinary expenses continue climbing. For many families, raising cattle has become a gamble: press on and lose money, or stop and lose everything. The strain is visible everywhere. Meat processing plants across the Midwest are reducing shifts, workers are losing income, truck drivers are left without loads, yet consumers see no relief. Supermarket beef prices continue rising. Ground beef now exceeds $6 per pound, the highest level since the early 1950s. Steak prices have reached $11 per pound for a working family earning roughly $2,500 a month. The question becomes painfully real: how often can they afford beef at all? And then a more unsettling doubt emerges: is American beef still safe? Canada's refusal has sparked suspicion among consumers that the issue runs deeper than tariffs. Memories have resurfaced of Europe's 1988 ban on U.S. beef over growth hormone concerns such as trenbolone and zeranol. Although industry leaders insist today's standards remain strict, once trust fractures, restoring it is never easy. As prices climb and subsidies shrink, the SNAP program supporting over 42 million Americans faces potential cuts totaling $300 billion over the next decade. For countless households, this means returning to bare minimum diets: ramen, canned food, and inexpensive bread. Even when beef remains available, single parents and seniors on fixed incomes must choose between a nutritious meal and paying utility bills. The consequences reach further still. Schools reduce meal portions, rural hospitals struggle to secure adequate protein for children and the elderly. The cycle accelerates: agriculture weakens, jobs disappear, communities decline. As grocery aisles empty, gas stations lose customers, and once stable towns hollow out. Anyone who witnessed America's rise through farming and labor understands this is not just about beef, it is a warning. And the most unsettling question remains: what happens if Canada not only deepens ties with Mexico, but expands its reach globally? Signs are already emerging that Ottawa is turning its attention toward China, Brazil, and Russia, revealing ambitions that stretch far beyond North America. These ambitions go far beyond simply finding an alternative beef supplier. Canada is working to transform its entire agricultural trade strategy. The rejection of 150,000 tons of American beef represents only a small part of a much broader strategic vision, one aimed at reducing economic reliance on the U.S. market and gradually shaping a new trade order where Ottawa no longer stands behind Washington. In fact, this shift has been underway for some time. In the 2025 to 2026 Beef Industry Development Plan, Canada clearly stated its intention to expand into markets across Asia, the Middle East, and South America. The Port of Vancouver, the country's largest export gateway, is undergoing major upgrades to expand shipping capacity to destinations beyond the United States. Once this infrastructure is complete, decisions such as rejecting American beef will appear far more logical. This was not an impulsive reaction to a trade dispute, but a carefully calculated move planned well in advance. What stands out is that Canada is not acting alone. The country is actively building ties with emerging trade hubs that were previously overlooked within the North American supply chain. China is the most visible example. After years of disruption caused by the pandemic and diplomatic strain, 2024 marked a turning point as both sides restored agricultural cooperation. Canada signed new quarantine agreements opening access for beef, dairy, and soybeans to major cities such as Shanghai and Beijing, markets where the U.S. is steadily losing ground. Then there is Russia, as China promotes intercontinental trade routes through Siberia. Canada is also working quietly through intermediary partners to connect with Eurasian logistics networks, opening new eastern trade routes without relying on the US. While Western governments remain cautious, Canada's relatively softer approach has allowed for careful yet proactive engagement. Brazil cannot be ignored, a South American agricultural powerhouse long recognized globally, but only recently viewed by Canada as a strategic partner. Brazilian meat processing facilities, many holding international certifications, are gradually replacing the role once dominated by American suppliers. In 2024 alone, Brazil's beef exports to Canada doubled, a development that surprised many U.S. farmers. Europe is also playing a quieter but significant role. The CETA agreement between Canada and the EU, signed in 2017, was initially focused on industry, but is now expanding into agriculture, particularly hormone-free and clean food products. As the EU continues its ban on American beef, Canada has positioned itself as a suitable alternative to fill that gap. This raises an important question: what can the US do to reverse this trend, and is there still a path to repair a relationship once considered strong and dependable? 3 possible scenarios may shape the future. When Canada unexpectedly rejected more than 150,000 tons of U.S. beef, many believed it was temporary, but viewed more broadly, it signals a deeper shift in a world changing by the day. The United States must now decide how it intends to maintain its position. The first scenario is continued protectionism, keeping tariffs in place to defend domestic farmers. This approach is familiar. The current administration has reinstated tariffs on China and expanded agricultural restrictions. While this may offer short-term relief, the burden ultimately falls on consumers. When food prices rise and essential products lose SNAP eligibility, trade policy becomes a daily struggle for families. Another option is returning to negotiations with partners like Canada or expanding cooperation across Latin America to rebuild supply chains that once brought regional stability. This would require more than goodwill. It would demand rebuilding trust with countries that once saw the US as a reliable pillar. This path is difficult, especially as many partners pivot toward Asia and Europe, but if successful, it could restore regional strength through cooperation. The third option carries the greatest risk: a full pivot toward new markets. The White House has announced plans to expand exports to Southeast Asia through early agreements with Indonesia and Vietnam, regions with young populations and rapidly growing food demand. If supported by investments in standards, logistics, and diplomacy, this could open new opportunities, yet there is no guarantee American beef will be welcomed with Canada's rejection still fresh. The real question is not just which option the US should choose, but whether enough time remains, or if America risks holding its seat only to lose it when it looks away. The world is moving and markets are not waiting. Canada's partnership with Mexico is more than a trade deal. It signals a shift in trust and a challenge to the old order. So what do you think? Should the US stand firm or adapt and open new doors for its agricultural future? Share your thoughts.